Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining our webinar on universal savings accounts. I'm excited to discuss this important policy reform with our two panelists and share the idea with all of you. But before we dive in, I've got a few housekeeping items for you. First, this is being recorded, and an email of the recording will be sent to you following this within 48 hours. We also encourage you all to submit your questions to the questions box, as you can see on the screen here. Please share your name and your organization so that we can credit the question to whoever is asking it. Lastly, all attendees are in listen-only mode. And with that, we will get started. I would like to invite our two guests to join me on screen by turning on their webcams. And we have with us Christina King first, who is a senior economist in her 10th year with the Joint Economic Committee, working for the chairman on the Social Capital Project. She examines policies that can improve economic opportunity for U.S. citizenry at large through the lens of social capital, which I hope we can get into a little bit more throughout the program. She was also a master's fellow at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. We also have with us Chris Edwards, who is the Director of Tax Policy Studies at the Cato Institute and editor of downsizinggovernment.org. Before joining Cato, Chris also worked at the Joint Economic Committee. He was a manager at PricewaterhouseCoopers and worked as an economist at the Tax Foundation. He's the author of Downsizing the Federal Government, and he's also the co-author of Global Tax Revolution, a book that I'd recommend to everyone. Before we dig in with questions for our panelists, I want to start with a brief overview. Following economic crises of all types, people tend to save a little bit more. We look around at governments, at businesses, and it's clear that over the past decade or so of good economic times, many of them have overextended themselves. Many individual Americans are no different. So as people again remember the benefits of increased savings and begin to put a little bit more away each month, Congress should do everything in its power to remove the current barriers that stand in the way of Americans saving a little additional money each and every month. No matter what they're saving for, whether it be a future rainy day, a new car, starting a family, folks should be able to save for whatever they prioritize in their life. The current system of government-approved savings accounts are complicated and only allow you to save for specific government-defined purposes. The system ultimately disadvantages the lowest income Americans and decreases levels of savings across the board. Universal savings accounts can hopefully fix this problem by streamlining the complexity and making saving something that is encouraged at every income level. And it will hopefully, in the current economic times, capitalize on the coming period of increased precautionary savings and allow more American families to secure their future on their own terms. So with that, I want to start with Chris. I know that you've been writing about USAs for a while, discussing the idea with lawmakers, with sort of anyone that will listen. And I was hoping you could start by explaining why you think USAs are so important and how they are different from, say, the savings account that I already have with my bank.
Well, thanks a lot for hosting today, Adam, and thank you to Heritage Foundation. I'm delighted to be here with Christina, who's written a great new report on universal savings accounts for the Joint Economic Committee. You know, my starting point here is that all savings is socially beneficial. All savings increases personal financial security. It provides investment funds for capital investment in the economy. And more personal savings can help reduce the burden of people needing various sorts of handouts from the government. But the basic problem is that the income tax creates a bias against savings. It encourages consumption now. If you have a wage earner He pays income tax when he earns his wage. If he goes out and buys an automobile, for example, there is no further income tax on that transaction. But if he is a frugal person and he saves up for a number of years to buy the car, he is taxed on the earnings in that savings account. That makes more sense. That makes no sense. The whole system is biased toward people consuming now. A lot of lawmakers have recognized this problem, and the bipartisan response over the decades has been to create separate savings accounts for different sort of politically determined activities. So we have retirement accounts, we have education savings accounts, we have health savings accounts. Those are all fine, but the truth is all savings are beneficial. During booms, during good times, people ought to be saving for unemployment. People may want to save to start up a business. Young people may want to save for a wedding or a first-time home purchase. The idea of universal savings accounts is that all savings are beneficial and all should achieve this neutral treatment in the tax code, eliminating the double taxation of savings. So the basic tax treatment of universal savings accounts would be the same as a Roth IRA. You earn money, and then you can put after-tax money into the accounts, and then the money can grow tax-free over time. And the key here is that you would be able to withdraw from the USA accounts at any time for any reason, tax and penalty free. That creates a huge amount of simplification in these accounts, and it increases liquidity. If you make the money easy to take out, you're going to encourage more people to put money into these accounts and save more. So that's the basic sketch of these universal savings accounts that have been discussed in Congress for a number of years now. I think now's the time to go ahead with these sorts of accounts.
One of the things that you mentioned in passing there was how someone might use these accounts as an unemployment benefit, or at times of unemployment. I think that's particularly pertinent today, in that even if we have an unemployment system, often there are delays in getting those benefits. There's all sorts of sort of hiccups in the system, as we're seeing right now. I think even if there's various other programs out there, encouraging individuals to have these types of accounts that they can draw on their own money is a way of really putting individuals in the driver's seat. And I think any time of the economic cycle is a good time for USAs, but right now just sort of shows this one particular benefit of putting people in charge of their own money. I want to turn to Christina and ask you to sort of elaborate on USAs in a sort of broader context. I know you've been looking at universal savings accounts. You have a new report that you linked to in the chat called Savings for Social Capital. Could you tell us a little bit more, first, what social capital is, and then how they relate to USAs and sort of the benefits of savings overall?
Certainly. So I'd first like to note that these are my own views, not of the chairman or of the Joint Economic Committee. But that said, social capital is the value of the things that we do together. It's the value of our relationships with our families, our friends, our neighbors, and coworkers. And the currency of these relationships is denominated in trust, empathy, fellow feeling. And essentially, I argue in the paper that financial capital in the form of savings undergirds social capital. So there are reasons to believe that savings increases social capital in many ways, but the research that examines this question directly is not that well developed. But we intuitively know that savings allows us to form and expand families, makes home ownership possible, and supports communities and institutions that enrich our lives. Savings is likely to support family stability. There's research that shows having assets may reduce parental stress and change aspirations for children. And obviously much of the benefits, or of the evidence on the benefits of savings, focuses on home ownership, which finds associations with improved neighborhood safety, more civic engagement, accelerated marriage and reduced divorce, and better child outcomes. And more broadly, savings is likely to generate greater charitable giving, which would be expected to strengthen civil society. So in a nutshell, universal savings accounts could help rectify the bias towards consumption over savings, which would increase the accessibility of savings and investment opportunities, growing financial capital, that could then support social capital.
Great, thank you. Chris, sort of picking up on this, on how how these accounts actually increase people's willingness to save and the amount that they save. This isn't necessarily a new idea. You and Ryan Bourne, one of your colleagues, has looked at similar accounts in the UK and in Canada. I was hoping you could sort of elaborate on the lessons you learned there and sort of what you found.
Well, thanks for the question, Adam. About 20 years ago, I wrote a Cato piece proposing this idea of universal savings accounts, and there didn't seem to be that much interest in it at the time. And then a number of years later, in 2009, I noticed that the country north of the border, Canada, had actually introduced and passed into law universal savings accounts. They call them tax-free savings accounts. Canadians can put $6,000 a year after tax into these accounts. All Canadians can put money in. There's no kind of restrictions in any way. These accounts, the money grows tax-free forever. People can withdraw whenever they want for any reason. These accounts have proved enormously popular. About half of all Canadians have these accounts. That compares, for example, in the United States to Roth IRA accounts. Only about 20% of Americans hold those accounts. So these new Canadian accounts already, they're only a decade old. Half of all households own the accounts. Similarly, in Britain, the UK in 1999 created what are called individual savings accounts. This was under a Labour or left of center government. And these accounts are remarkable. All British residents can put up to £20,000 or about $25,000 a year into these accounts. Again, the money grows tax-free forever. You can withdraw for any reason at any time. Again, these accounts are hugely popular. Over 40% of all Brits have these accounts. So I think Canada and Britain show that there is a huge demand for the idea of a universal savings account. And going back to what you said a little earlier, Adam, that we're in a recession now. People are unemployed. They need access to money. We're seeing this year a lot of people withdrawing from their 401k accounts, which most of us don't think is really great because that money is supposed to be there for retirement. But that leakage from 401k accounts, you can see, really represents a demand for a universal savings account that is different from retirement accounts. So the way I would perceive, an optimal kind of savings system is have a larger and strengthened 401k system for retirement, but then separately allow Americans, all households, a separate universal account for savings for all other types of purposes. And that way, I think we get the strongest savings system that we can get.
Yeah, I'd also like to add that there's a clear interest in having more of a general purpose emergency savings option, for which USA's would clearly be a great vehicle. There's actually a number of companies that are offering these on an ad hoc basis. I know that SunTrust Banks is testing out a version that allows auto deposits for employee paychecks with encouraging employer matching. So as the popularity of these kinds of accounts grows, USA's could naturally offer portability as workers switch between jobs too.
Christina, if you could, I know that in your report you touch on this issue in depth as well. Can you elaborate on how the sort of complexity of the current matrix of accounts disadvantages or discourages people from savings simply because of this sort of the complexity of only having government approved savings options that maybe have to be earmarked in advance?
Sure. So the current exception, as you said, generally involve retirement, education, disability, health and dependent care. Each has a particular purpose with the eligibility standards, withdrawal penalties for non-designated purposes, age limits, time limits, the restrictions go on. And as we've mentioned with the health savings account, those are only allowable if the account holder has a high deductible health plan that may not work for all families. Not all employers offer retirement plans, and if they do, they might not extend the benefit to all of the positions. And additionally, taxpayers have to have a specific type of taxable income to contribute to an IRA. So if you try to claim an exception to the rules, that can be risky because you could incur a tax penalty if you don't meet those requirements. For example, if a filer takes an early distribution from a 401k in order to cover medical costs, but incorrectly estimates adjusted gross income, or the distribution is too large relative to the medical costs, he or she would still have to pay a fine or partial or full penalty on the excess. And that penalty tax is on top of the income tax for that distribution. So the other important point is plans and goals change. Unfortunately, the allowable uses of those specific tax advantage savings accounts does not change. And Adam, I think you actually mentioned in your work before that low-income savers are nearly 1/3 more likely to face an additional tax penalty for improperly withdrawing during a personal financial crisis. So obviously this would make a lot of people very reticent about locking up their resources in these accounts if accessing the money is difficult, even if the tax advantage is there over traditional savings.
Yeah, can I underline something Christina just said there? I think this is really important because sometimes critics will say that, well, savings accounts in tax law only benefit people with higher incomes. In fact, if you look at the data in Canada and Britain, the big bulk of accounts are owned by people of moderate incomes. I was just looking at the data yesterday. Both Britain and Canada, if people are interested, provide very detailed statistics on their accounts. So in Britain, 70% of the holders of their universal accounts have annual income of less than $38,000 a year. And in Canada, half of all holders on their tax-free or universal savings accounts are under $50,000 a year. As Christina said, I think, what is going on here is that moderate income people, they may not want to lock up their money for decades later on for retirement because they may need it in the near term. So the key of universal savings accounts is liquidity. It is easy to get access to your money. The easier you create access, the better liquidity you have, the more people are going to be encouraged to save. So I think that's one of the keys to why these accounts have proven to be so popular in Canada and Britain for moderate income people. And I think that's the component missing in all these US savings vehicles. A last point on that, if you look at actually the distribution on usage, the US accounts like Roth IRAs are slanted a little toward higher income users. The universal accounts in Canada and Britain are slanted much more to moderate and lower income people. And I think it's the liquidity, the ease of withdrawal that is the key to these accounts.
I'd encourage everyone to check out a chart that I think Christina has in her most recent paper that we've referenced several times that shows that distribution Chris was just mentioning. It sort of charts among the same income quintiles how 401ks tend to be used by higher income folks at higher rates, where these accounts in the UK and Canada have a pretty even distribution across income groups. The other piece that is interesting is they also tend to be used by younger cohorts as well. And I think this speaks to conversations that I've had myself, where people will ask, hey, I know I should be saving, but should I be saving in my 529 account for my kids' college, or should I be saving in my 401k for retirement? And it's having to make that decision now, that when I decide I need to put money away, now I have to explicitly earmark it for one savings outcome or another, is often paralyzes a lot of people. It's something that I myself has sort of paused and waited and said, maybe I'm not ready to say this money is going to be just for this purpose. And that, I think, can drive a lot of folks simply not using the current saving system. Is sort of in this line of questioning, I know that there's been proposals out there as USAs have floated around where people have proposed adding various requirements on USAs, whether or not you have to keep the money in there for a certain number of years, or you can only access the accounts until you hit a certain income threshold, say $200,000 a year. I'd like to hear from both Christina and Chris, sort of how you think through these requirements, the positives and benefits of them, and sort of go from there.
Sure.
Yeah, I can.
So,
So in Canada, I think has been most successful in creating the simplest possible accounts. They have accounts you can put in up to $6,000 a year. And that's it. There's basically no other rules. You can withdraw for any reason at any time. They have these simple accounts. Everyone knows that these accounts exist in Canada. You walk into any bank branch, There's advertising for these accounts. You can open them online as easily as you can just open a regular bank account. So a lot of people in both Canada and Britain, they'll just park cash there in these accounts, while they're waiting to figure out what to do, as you're saying, Adam, to figure out how they want to save it in particular. Simplification has to be the key here. People have to know that these accounts are universal. Anyone can use them, and you can withdraw for any reason at any time. That has to be the way we go with these accounts. You get a lot of benefits by that simplification. You get the liquidity benefits, and you encourage more people to save because they know that they're so simple.
Yeah, I'd echo that simplicity here is key, just reducing the general bias against savings in the tax code. And I don't see the income restriction as necessary. The annual contribution limit is just that every year. It's the same across the income distribution. And you could implement other reforms that aim to sunset other goal-specific tax-advantaged accounts that are more heavily utilized by higher income families. And additionally, yeah, again, having that time limit reduces the likelihood that lower income families would participate. They're more likely to experience negative income shocks. A large emergency expense could come up before the time limit is done, and they could be paying a steep penalty again for access to that savings. So the real consequence here is actually the loss of earnings by withdrawing funds early instead of allowing them to grow over time. And so you don't need a penalty tax to add insult to injury.
Thank you both. We are getting a bunch of great questions from the audience, and I've got a couple more of my own. But I'll encourage folks to continue to put their questions in the question box, and we'll get to them. One of the things that's come up in a couple of different places is just a little bit more information about what exactly USA looks like when it's actually implemented. We have a question from a heritage donor, Chris M, and he asks, are these savings accounts where one can invest, save, or spend as needed in the future, similar to healthcare medical savings accounts for any income group to enhance economic security? Would one of you just sort of touch a little bit more on how these would operate in practice? Chris,
I'm happy to. So my proposal for USA accounts is that it would be a universal account. All individuals could put up to $10,000 a year after tax into the accounts. Then essentially there's no more rules. You can withdraw for any reason at any time. Within the accounts, you could invest in stocks and bonds and other sort of mutual funds and other sorts of investments like that. But that's basically it. You could either while Congress introduces these accounts, they could either eliminate Roth IRAs and IRAs and maybe some other accounts to simplify the system, maybe even 529 accounts. That would simplify the whole system. Or you could just simply introduce these new accounts, and these accounts would be superior to 529s and IRAs of all types. And so they would sort of go out of fashion anyway, and everyone would use these new universal accounts. So that's how I would see the system working down the road.
Is there a standard interest rate in a USA, or?
No, I mean, just like when people in the 401k accounts can choose a variety of different investments, index funds, actively managed funds, whatever, bond funds. The same would be true within USA accounts. There would be a wide range of investment options available.
Yeah, you could potentially model the way that the health savings accounts do that. Kind of they give you the ability to withdraw funds immediately if you need it, or have a particular set of your funds invested. Ideally, financial institutions sponsoring these would, yeah, as you mentioned, have plans that are oriented towards particular savings goals if you wanted. If you're saving for college, you could have a targeted fund, saving for retirement, longer term, or you can even have different age groups that have a different mix of risk in the investments.
Christina, I know that in your writing you have a pretty specific proposal with, as Chris was mentioning, how USAs could be part of broader simplification. Is that something you can touch on briefly?
Sure. So yeah, like Chris had mentioned, ideally with the plan, policymakers would sunset Roth IRAs, ABLE accounts, Coverdell ESAs, and 529 accounts, which all also feature this after-tax contribution and tax-free distribution, the way that a Roth style USA would do. You could do, I argue for an annual contribution limit equal to 35,000 less the total contributions to other defined contribution plans and traditional IRAs. So let's say, for example, you maxing out your 401k, you with a contribution of $19,500, that would leave you with about $15,500 in space to contribute to your USA. And that ultimately helps you like allow for the short to medium term goals in addition to some of your longer term goals. And I also talk about how any adult could contribute to another's USA, but that would count to that beneficiary's annual contribution limit, and contributions to others' accounts would be subject to the gift tax if applicable too. So that would kind of be another limitation there. And that's pretty much it. After-tax contributions, earnings would not be taxed, removes the guesswork of tax deferral up front or taxes owed on withdrawals.
Thank you. Before we turn more exclusively to the questions coming in from the audience, the last one for me for now is USAs, at least to me, seem like a great idea. The simplicity makes sense, but they seem to hit roadblocks in Congress. They move forward in fits and starts. Do you guys have any insight as to what those barriers are and sort of how we can keep pushing this idea forward?
I mean, I think they are popular, amongst Republicans. I mean, I guess up to about a decade ago, former Senator Jeff Flake and Representative David Bratt introduced House and Senate versions of USA accounts. The Republicans, after they passed their big tax reform in 2017, they proposed and passed through the House a tax reform 2.0 bill, and that included universal savings accounts. So I think the Republicans are on board, and we do need more convincing for some Democrats. I do fear that the current Democratic Party and possible President Joe Biden, they're really come out with a lot of anti-savings proposals. Joe Biden is proposing to raise the capital gains tax up to 40%, which is a really kind of a bizarre proposal. Since the beginning of the income tax a century ago, we've almost always had a much lower capital gains rate to encourage investment or savings in startup businesses and entrepreneurship. So I fear that the Democrats are sort of going the wrong way on savings. But there may be a chance if we do another sort of a bailout bill for an aid for the COVID-19 crisis this year, that maybe USA accounts could be there. The way I see USA accounts is there would be a way to build resilience for possible future recessions. We want to build resilience by getting people to save. And so that's what I think, that's the general idea of USA accounts.
Christina?
I think any remaining reticence around that goes back to the critique that USAs might be just another carve out for the rich, but in reality, it's the other way around. The existing savings accounts with the tax advantage are more accessible to higher income families, or more likely have the resources to spare, and to hire professionals to help them navigate the complexities that are associated with them. And it's worth, again, going back to the chart that we were talking about earlier for Canada's version of USA as the tax-free savings account. It is more broadly used across the income spectrum. The bottom two income quintiles among Canadians, they're twice as likely to have a TFSA, over 20% and nearly 40% respectively, as their American counterparts are in those bottom two quintiles to have an IRA or a Keogh account. So it's important to continue to drive the message home that USAs are just more egalitarian accounts than the system of disparate accounts that we currently have. And in fact, I'll also point out with the United Kingdom's individual savings accounts, they were made for the express purpose of enabling lower and middle income families to save more. And so they actually eliminated some previous tax advantage accounts in the process, which further provided simplification. And I think that's important for any potential reform here, one that aims to reduce the types of goal-specific accounts available in favor of the more accessible USA. And folks will find that USAs can serve a broader share of Americans.
Awesome. Well, thank you guys. I want to turn to some of the questions coming in from the audience. I'm going to start with a sort of nuts and bolts question that hopefully you guys have an answer to or an idea. We've got a question from Dean from AFP, and he wants to know what the CBO sort of scorekeeping score of instituting something like universal savings accounts would look like. Like, what would the quote unquote cost be if they were to score something like this? Christina, do you have a sense of that?
Honestly, it does depend on the design and what other reforms that you are doing in addition to establishing a USA. I believe with the Family Savings Act of 2018, even for that $2,500 per family, that was 8.6 billion that the CBO scored over 10 years, but that was obviously a very static score. It didn't consider dynamic effects and just looked at the 10-year window instead of the broader time horizon.
Yeah, what I would say on that is, I'm not in favor of increasing the deficit in any way, and the revenue loss could easily be offset. And my favorite target there is the tax-free status of municipal bond interest. Currently, the federal government has this massive subsidy for state and local governments and essentially high-income people by completely exempting the interest on municipal, in other words, city and state bonds. So I think a fair trade would be to eliminate that tax-free status of muni bonds, thus raising substantial revenue from higher income Americans, and then using that revenue to introduce universal savings accounts, which are more broadly beneficial. So I think you can introduce these accounts in a way that doesn't lose the government revenue and actually makes the system more sort of distributionally fair.
I think it's you mentioning the interest deduction for muni bonds is interesting in this context because it also incentivizes local governments to take on additional debt, which is really the opposite of what a USA is trying to do. It's trying to encourage people to save more on their own rather than encouraging more debt in the broader economic system. So I like that pairing. A good question from Katie Tubb, who's a colleague of mine at the Heritage Foundation. She wants to know, what is the strongest argument against USAs, and what's your response to that critique? I'll start with you, Christina.
So again, I guess the strongest argument is people's perception that it's going to be a carve out for the rich, when in fact it's not. And again, I'll go back to the evidence. The evidence internationally speaks for itself that these are more broadly used. And actually, there is one more critique, which was that people would simply redistribute their savings instead of saving more. And actually, I think that your previous work, Adam, pointed to a lot of evidence that actually, even particularly among lower income savers, they ended up saving more with the introduction of a universal savings account.
Yeah, that research, I think, came from Canada, and the critique is that people will simply transfer their existing savings from retirement into a universal savings account, either meaning you get no additional savings or even crowd out retirement savings. And it seems that people in general don't do that people will continue to save for retirement, especially in our system where your employer will match your retirement savings. But this simply expands the universe of new savings so that people are simply putting more away in the aggregate. And that's, I think that's really cool to see. And it just proves that the current complicated system we have in the US actually does discourage savings. Chris, do you have anything to add on that question?
Well, I would point out both Canada and Britain already had retirement accounts like our 401k system, where people and companies got deductions up front. So they already had the retirement system like we do now, and they decided that people needed this universal way to save for all other savings purposes. And so, you know, I don't think that there is a big barrier here to introduction. I think maybe one of the only reasons why it was not in the Republican 2017 bill is that Republicans and President Trump wanted like a big tax cut now that people would immediately see on their, you know, their pay stub or something like that. The idea of universal savings accounts is not really so much about the tax cut, it's creating a long-term benefit for people. And so I think that there's no big political barrier to it. It's just a matter of educating policymakers about the long-term advantages to families.
Just a point of clarification, I've got a question from Alexis at Tax Notes, and the question is, are these accounts fully tax-free in your proposal? Chris, could you elaborate on sort of maybe Roth versus traditional versus fully tax-free, like health savings accounts?
Right. So health savings accounts in our current systems are completely tax-free. There's no tax up front, and there's no tax when people use the income. Most of the savings accounts in our system, of course, like 401ks and IRAs, the tax either comes up front or it comes later on. The tax treatment of USA accounts would be like Roth IRAs, where the tax comes up front. In other words, you contribute after-tax earnings, but then there's no further tax when you on earnings and withdrawals. In my view, that creates neutrality. It creates neutrality between consumption now and consumption in the future. And I think that's, you know, as an economist, that's what I want. I like neutrality in the tax system. You know, and I would say this, that, you know, the tax barrier to saving is not the only reason why Americans don't save enough. There are other causes of America's low savings rate. And this would only, you know, help us with one of those causes, but it would be a step forward, I think, in making Americans more resilient and increasing their incentive to save.
I've got another question here from James on how the U.S. might adopt similar programs like Canada, where you can transfer existing savings into universal savings accounts. Is that something that, I think that's something that can happen in Canada, Chris? Is that, can you speak a little bit more to that?
Sure. I mean, if we introduce universal savings accounts, let's say with a $10,000 annual contribution cap, people could certainly withdraw from you know, taxable accounts and put money into universal savings accounts. That would be fine from my point of view. It would still encourage more savings, and like I said, it would create neutrality. We want neutrality in our tax system. We want to eliminate that double taxation or bias against savings in the tax code. So whether people put in fresh money, which it would encourage, or whether people would move money from taxable accounts, that would be fine. I think both make sense to me.
And I argue actually in the proposal in the paper that you should be able, especially as you're sunsetting other accounts, that you should be able to roll in from other after-tax accounts like the 529s that you're sunsetting, the Coverdell ESAs and so forth. And if you wanted to convert from some traditional money, IRA money, you pay the income tax on it, and then you can roll that into your universal savings account.
I think one of the things I remember when I was looking at the difference between Roth versus traditional, whether or not you pay the tax at the beginning or when you pull the money out, is there's often an argument where that if you provide the deduction today, people are going to save more, but people also tend to save more if you pay the taxes initially, because we have in our minds we're going to save $5,000, whether it's before tax or after tax. And so a lot of the sort of depending on which one you favor or how it's designed, the idea is simply removing that extra layer of capital gains and dividends taxes, and paired with the simplicity of just picking one and sticking with it, that I think can be so powerful as part of this reform. One thing we haven't touched on really explicitly today is what this would do for sort of economic growth overall. We talked a lot about how this increases individual savings, sort of more money in yours or my pocketbook. Christina, maybe starting with you, is there sort of a broader macroeconomic piece of this reform that we should fit USAs into?
I think greater investment, of course, would increase economic growth. But coming at this more of from the social capital angle per se, this kind of does a lot more for civil society, and especially from like the charitable contributions context when you're looking at a macro level. And actually, in a recent paper that was produced by my colleague Robert Belfory on the charitable deduction. It was interesting that the pattern for lower income families, they gave more to for the poor, and as opposed to higher income families that gave more to the arts and other institutions. And so enabling lower income families to save more, to give more to charity would also help lower income Americans help themselves, but also for the causes that they support more broadly in civil society.
Excellent. Before we wrap up, I've got one more question here from Warren. He asks, could USAs be a means of transferring wealth from grandparents to grandchildren? Either one of you have thoughts on sort of how to structure intergenerational component of these? Chris?
I didn't address that in my studies. I haven't thought about that in detail.
Yeah, likely. I think that's kind of more of the minutia, like that really depends on the design. Certainly, you want to make sure that everything is fair and you're not using any particular arbitrage. But the way that the current system exists, or the current system is with trusts and other things like that, I don't see any particular points of. I don't know where I was going with that point. I'm sorry.
No worries. I think the way that makes most sense to structure these accounts is that any individual has one, and anyone can contribute money to it, whether it be that individual, their grandparents, their employer, or their contractor, like Uber, if you're an Uber driver. And so, as long as everyone is kept by that, whatever it be, $10,000 annual contribution limit, doesn't matter where that money comes from. It should then it belongs to the individual account holder, and it can grow, be invested, and used. So that's at least one way to structure them so that they're even more universally applicable. With that, we're running up against the sort of end of our time together. Before I let you and everyone else go, I'd like to just ask you each to close with 30 seconds or a minute on either something we left out or your sort of closing thought on universal savings accounts that you want to leave everyone with. I'll start with Chris, and then we'll end with Christina.
Well, I think, we're discussing this in the context of a deep recession we are in, and the COVID-19 crisis this year. I think one thing we've learned this year is that recessions will come along and crises will come along and surprise us. We thought that, everyone thought the economy was going to continue growing forever, and they weren't saving enough. So I hope Americans remember that, economists can't predict the future. We don't know when recessions are going to happen. Everyone in society needs to, during good times, need to reduce their debt and increase their savings. And I'm talking about governments and businesses and individuals. I think that the foreign experience here has shown us that there is a large demand for a universal savings account vehicle that would be broadly used across the spectrum of all households. And I think, I'd like to see the United States go in that direction. I think we should introduce universal savings accounts with perhaps a $10,000 or so annual contribution limit. And I think it would go a long way to increasing personal financial security in the future so that people are more prepared for these sorts of downturns.
So I'd say the issue at hand is that
Thank you. Christina?
Sorry for the delay. The issue at hand is that tax policy penalizes savings. This affects social capital deepening and its benefits for individuals in society. Compared to the jumble of existing tax savings accounts, as we've discussed, USAs would make savings more accessible, impartial, flexible, and portable. And most importantly, USAs would assist families as they pursue their own savings goals throughout life, be flexible when those plans change, when those goals change, and ultimately they would finance the creation and development of valuable relationships and institutions throughout society. They would promote charitable giving to help Americans in need, and they would help lower income Americans help themselves.
Well, thank you, Chris, Christina. Thank you everyone for joining us. You can see the Twitter handles and contact information for everyone here. It should be up on your screen. Feel free to reach out. Thank you again, and hope everyone has a great rest of your day.